Great. A very good afternoon to everyone. A warm welcome to this live webinar organized by Motor India, powered by Cure Technologies. In June this year, we had done a webinar on how location technology can help enhance the connected vehicle experience. Today, our focus will be on one of the hottest topics in the industry, not just now, but has been the case for a long time: electric vehicles and e mobility. How location is fast tracking the adoption of EVs in India and the region. It is pretty obvious that EVs are here to stay, and EV adoption is happening at an aggressive pace, especially in segments and use cases where users and end customers see economic sense. So today we're going to dwell upon the role location technology can play to drive EV adoption in our country. And for this, we have a set of experts from the EV industry, each of whom will bring a unique perspective in the panel discussion we have in store for you today. Just outlining the agenda for today's session, we will start off with a presentation by our partner Here Technologies, followed by a panel discussion for about an hour, post which we will take audience questions before we wrap up the session. As always, I have the privilege of introducing our speakers today. Our presenter for today is Mr. Andre Yordake, Director of Industry Solutions Automotive at Here Technologies, who leads the division's strategy and business development globally. In his current role, Andre works with automotive companies and tier ones to enhance driving experiences by harnessing the power of location data and location-based services. He's well versed in product strategy, advanced product planning, connected services, and e-mobility, working previously for several automotive OEMs. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today, Andre, and we look forward to your presentation. For the panel discussion, we have four distinguished speakers. First up, we have Dr. Deb Mukherjee, Managing Director, Omega Seiki Mobility, one of India's leading and fastest growing EV OEMs. Deb has worked with leading Indian as well as global companies such as Suzuki and Honda, and has set up greenfield plants across India, Mexico, and Thailand. He is currently spearheading OSM's growth story and will bring in the EV OEM perspective in today's discussion. Our second speaker is Mr. Amit Gupta, who is the business head for Energy Infrastructure Solutions at Delta Electronics India. Amit's responsibilities encompass businesses like e-mobility infra solutions, renewable energy, and energy storage solutions. During his time at Delta Electronics India, he has nurtured a strong foundation for the e-mobility and energy storage solution businesses. And under his leadership, Delta India has been able to accomplish close cooperation with major stakeholders in the EV charging infrastructure sector. So he will represent the charging infrastructure side of the EV ecosystem in today's discussion. Our next speaker is Ms. Ayushi Jain, Vice President, External Relations at Moving, a homegrown electric mobility tech platform agnostic across OEMs, vehicle types, and charging technologies, focusing on last mile intra-city delivery vehicles. Ayushi's career has been focused on clean tech adoption, having spent 4 years in California, majorly with the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator across multiple sectors, including sustainable cities, water, transportation, and waste management. In India, she's worked with Shakti Foundation and most recently led policy and government partnerships at an EV company named Bounce. Our fourth and final speaker is Mr. Animesh Kumar Sahai, who is the head of customers, India and South Asia at Here Technologies. Animesh has over 24 years of experience and has worked in sales leadership positions for various organizations like CA Technologies, RAD, Juniper Networks, and Oracle. Representing here in the panel, which is a location intelligence and technology leader globally, Animesh will bring in a technology angle in today's discussion. We're delighted to have the four of you with us here today, and we look forward to an engaging discussion. And to moderate that discussion, we have a very well-known face from the industry, Mr. Ashim Sharma, who leads the Business Performance Improvement Group at Nomura Research Institute Consulting in India, with key focus on areas such as overall business strategy, new product development, technological readiness, innovation readiness, scenario planning, market entry, etc. Ashim has developed thought leadership in scenario planning, alternate automotive powertrains, such as electric, hybrid, natural gas, modularity, new forms of mobility, among others. Great to have you with us once again, Ashim. Thank you for your acceptance. And you can take over once Andre's presentation is done. And for the audience, as informed earlier, our panelists will be happy to answer your questions after the panel discussion. Our presenter, Andre, will also be available with the panelists. So if you have any questions related to his presentation or the panel discussion, please feel free to share them with us. That's all from my side. I now hand over to Andre for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Bala, for the great introduction. Also, thank you for the opportunity to join you live from Berlin, to be part of this esteemed panel discussing the challenges of EV in one of the markets, in one of the, let's say, fastest growing markets in the world. I'll be sharing my presentation, which shares a bit some of our experiences and some of the learnings that we had by working with OEMs and tier ones and charging providers across the world. And particularly, I'll be addressing the challenges, but also I'll be putting up for discussion some of the, let's say, some of the contribution, how location technology is an enabler for adoption of EVs. Because at the end of the day, with everything that's new, and EV is pretty new in many parts of the world, it's all about planning. And location technology can actually help the users better plan and better extract, let's say, the capabilities out of their EVs, and at the end form a better user experience. As Bala said, actually, EV is the hottest topic in automotive. And if, let's say, in 2010, 2015, there was a lot of talk about EVs coming on the market, now we're actually seeing globally that every single OEM is putting, let's say, is investing into EV and have very aggressive plans of deploying EVs. I don't think there's actually a single OEM that does not have an EV in planning. And actually, most of the major OEMs, they're putting big investments, and they're also talking about a high percentage share of their vehicle volumes to be electrified. So if we're looking at things in starting from 2023, big companies like GMs or Volkswagen, they already talk about millions of EVs being deployed globally. Also, other big groups like Hyundai or Toyota, they are, again, aiming by 2025 to have big investments and have big EVs on the road. And if we're looking towards 2030, everybody is thinking to have at least half of their vehicles sold globally with an EV powertrain. This could also be a plug-in hybrid for some markets, but in probably most of the markets, the EVs would be the most represented. And we also know of a couple of brands that will be EV only going forward. So brands like luxury brands like Cadillac, or luxury brands from the Tata Group like the Jaguar Land Rover, they're also talking about having a big share of EVs and having Jaguar only as an EV. So definitely EV is on top of everyone's mind. And actually every single market and the customers will have to, let's say, be ready for it. Also looking at India, seeing from outside of India, I'm actually quite impressed with the recent announcements. Just in a couple of weeks, I just selected, let's say, a couple of examples that really draw my attention, with EVs that are really attractive and really capable EVs coming in the market, with announcements from Ola and Mahindra, and also the ones that have joined us today for the panel, Omega Seiki, they're also having an offering very interesting for commercial vehicles, which is also a very good segment to deploy such a technology, also to maximize efficiency, to reduce the cost, and also reduce pollution in the most dense areas where deliveries are actually being done. So all in all, if the article that I read was right, we're looking at a very accelerated pace in India with a compound annual growth rate of over 47% in the next 5 years. So this is really exciting to see how the local players, really exciting to see how the market in India is developing. But before we're also kind of like getting excited about this big EV future, we also have to look about the challenges that come with EV. And we'll look at the challenges starting from the users, from the driver perspective, but also try to reflect a bit about how each player being an OEM, being a charging provider, being an infrastructure provider, being government, would actually have to have in mind to address these challenges to make sure that the experience of the final user is optimal. And last but not least, we also look at how location technology, so location data, can actually help with these challenges. Location data cannot solve everything, but of course, it can provide better information and better decision for the drivers, for the vehicles, for the planning operators to deploy the EV optimal solutions. So, starting from the driver perspective, what are some of the EV challenges that we're actually foreseeing? Even if the range of EVs is definitely growing, it's not yet on par with combustion engines. And this might be, let's say, a real challenge or maybe also a perceived challenge. But when you are used as a driver to say that your vehicle can easily, your combustion engine vehicle can easily drive 500, 600 kilometers, and then you're looking at an EV that maybe in real world can do half of that, at least in the adoption phase, people would be starting asking questions is, how can I achieve this range? Where can I make sure that I'm not running out of battery? And will I be, let's say, stranded on longer trips? Actually, this comes with the experience, and in reality, it's not as bad to have 200, 300 kilometers of range, but it is part of the, let's say, questions that EV drivers they're having when they're opting for an EV. The second, it also comes together with the charging network and the charging infrastructure. And there are parts of the world where this is actually no longer the case. So one of the good examples is basically Netherlands. But Netherlands is like a small country, so they have lots of chargers, and currently they have a ratio of 1 charger to 6 EVs. So you could say that that's a very good ratio to have, and the EVs are well supplied with the charging infrastructure. But I was also reading about what's happening in India. And again, if the article that I was reading was correct, the share is actually 1 charger to over 100 EVs. So, of course, this, and also India being a big country, this remains a topic that customers would be, let's say, asking, where can we find the chargers and how can we actually make use of the infrastructure? Of course, also the infrastructure is growing fast. So no question about that. Every single year, there will be more and more charges, but users would probably have to learn. We have to make sure that they can reach these charges, and these are, let's say, accessible, and they know them, and they make use of the part of their planning. Then there's also a challenge regarding the range of EVs, because EVs are actually even more sensitive to external factors than normal cars are. So the way that you are driving, your speed could actually have a big impact. If you're driving, let's say, in a city versus if you're driving on a highway, the impact is actually much greater. The speed on the highway and the higher speeds, because of the, let's say, the aerodynamic loss that EVs are facing, does have actually a big impact on achieving your range. So if in, let's say, a 300 kilometers range in a city, probably could be only 200 on a highway. But also other things. So based on the battery age, based on how well the battery has been actually maintained and how it has been utilized, this would have another effect. Weather does have actually also a very big impact. So very cold weather or very hot weather actually impact the range itself of the EV, just because you have to use the heating, but also because the EV battery would have to be maintained and would have to be kept at a constant temperature. So these outside weather variations would do have an impact. But there's also another element, and this is where we're also learning that the route that you are actually taking does also have an impact. So if you're driving uphill, or if you're driving downhill, or if it's an area where there's a lot of stops, like lots of junctions, or an area with lots of curves, or maybe an area with strong winds, this also has an impact of how well you are achieving your range. So these are, let's say, the external factors that an EV would probably have to, or an EV driver would actually have to have in mind to make sure that he's reaching his destination and he has a realistic view of the range that he should be expect on his trip. Then there are also, let's say, different charging standards and connectors. And even in places, let's say, mature places where there's a large infrastructure, sometimes you might end up to a charging station that actually does not have your connector. You might be going to a, let's say, Tesla charging station, and that one would not be compatible with your CCS car. Or you might be, let's say, going to a CHAdeMO charging station or other standards around the world. So the charging standards, the connectors, but also the power of the charging stations. Of course, this is something that has to be considered part of the road planning of an EV driver, being, let's say, a private driver, or even more a professional, a commercial driver. And last but not least, it's all about the charging times. This is also something that EV drivers would have to be aware and to plan accordingly, because even the fastest charging times out there, are kind of like even in the absolute best case, they are still 5 times slower than fueling. So if I take your average petrol car, maybe it takes 3 to 4 minutes to fill the tank fully. And if I take probably the best example, so the vehicle with the highest charging capabilities, like let's say a Porsche Taycan with the highest charging station, 350 kilowatts, this one takes over 20 minutes to have a comparable, let's say, charging session to filling a tank. So this actually takes time, and actually the impact is not when you are the first in the charging station. It's what happens if you are like the second or the third. You have to add up the time for each vehicle that's before you to part of the journey. So this is also why it's actually important to have visibility, to know where the charging stations are, to also have information about the status of the charging station, if it's operating, if it's available, or what you should be expecting when you are getting to that charging station, to have realistic planning and to make sure that you are reaching your destination without significant delays. So this is, the kind of things that the EV drivers would face on the road. I'm talking this from the experience of working with the customers, but I'm also an EV driver myself on a daily. And these are, let's say, factors, even if that you are learning yourself. So you can definitely, with the right information, you can overcome this challenge easily, but it is part of the early adoption. And I think maybe early adopters would be having a bit more, let's say, interest and understanding to go to this learning curve, while someone who just says, okay, I'm no longer an early adopter, I expect the EV to operate the same as the vehicle that I'm swapping, being combustion, might not be so well prepared with this. So then there's kind of like the challenge from the vehicle manufacturers. How do you actually simplify the usage of EV? And some of the EV challenges actually that we have learned with multiple from the manufacturers is that in very big regions, and I would assume that also India would be quite similar, is that you would have multiple charging providers to cover a large region. You would not have, let's say, one single provider that has the coverage everywhere. Certain providers, they have the better coverage in certain parts of a region or of a country. So you would have to be able to integrate and to aggregate the data from these charging providers and actually to provide it together with, let's say, the vehicle. And this would be either in your charging app or in your navigation system in a dashboard. You would have to be able to make it as easy as possible for the drivers to find their preferred charging stations from their preferred charging providers and to be able to leverage this part of routing. This is also part of enhancing the user experience. So together with providing the information where the charging stations are, there is also a good reason to provide complementary location information. Like in many cases, if you are charging for 30 minutes to 1 hour, you might want to know, okay, what other points of interest are next to your charging station? Is there like a coffee place, or can I go to, can I do something? Is there like a park where I can maybe take my kids and just play around until the vehicle is getting electricity so we can continue our road? So this is usually EV itself, or let's say the EV charging information would have to be coupled with other location information to also to provide this alternative to cover the charging breaks that the EV drivers are expected. And then it also comes together with providing the most accurate range estimation and alleviate this range anxiety. And this is also the parameter of the range en route, because very often you might be leaving your house on a journey, or you might be, if you're a commercial driver, you might be leaving on your to do the deliveries that you're expected, and you'll have to mix multiple stops together with maybe some charging breaks along the route. And of course, you would have to have some understanding of what kind of a route is this. If you're going into a city, you're going into an area with low speeds, most likely your range would increase. Or if you're going on the highway, your range might actually decrease versus the estimation that you have when you are starting your vehicle. So of course, also the driving style would probably have a learning, would also have an impact. So all about this kind of like learning how you are using the EV and provide better range estimation to the drivers. Then there's also the, let's say, the topic of the fleet operators. And we know that EVs are more and more used in mobility and transportation, being ride-hailing, being, let's say, last mile delivery. EVs are there's actually a very good case in terms of cost basis to leverage EVs. Also, if they're used in urban areas, there's also a very good reason because they're not polluting where they are being used. So, yeah, very attractive to be leveraged by the fleet operators. But this is where, you know, if you're a commercial driver versus a private driver, the time that you are actually losing in unplanned charging or, let's say, doing additional stops actually costs you money. It's not just the time that you're wasting, it's also kind of like the unproductive time that you should be spending delivering things instead of doing the charging stops. So these long shifts that are actually expected to also consider planned charging breaks due to the limited range. So this is where elements like multi-stop routing would have to be considered. And then there's also the limited availability of fast charging stations in city centers. I was talking previously that, you know, even the fastest EV, even the fast charging EVs, let's say charge in 20, 30 minutes, typically those charging stations would not be in a city, they will be on a highway. So if you operate in a city, you have to, let's say, to couple it with your lunch break or to have, let's say, overnight stops, because once you're getting in on your route and on your job, you might not just, let's say, go for a planned unstop of the charging station that you are seeing on the street, as that might not be fast enough for you to operate. And then, of course, the job allocation also depends on the battery status. So knowing kind of like how far, what's the range map of a vehicle, and can you actually reach to do the next delivery, or maybe it's better to send the next vehicle to do that job, is very important for the fleet operators to have this. And then applicable for everyone is about the charging station's power and actually the compatibility. Sometimes you might be getting to charging stations that might be looking as available, but in reality, they might just be, you know, just normal plugs and not suitable for, let's say, a light commercial vehicle that does an EV delivery. So I think it's also important to avoid the stops at the charging stations that actually do not provide the adequate power for the battery capacity and the battery needs of that specific vehicle. Then there's also an information there's also an element of the infrastructure providers, right? How do you optimize your infrastructure to support the EV rollout and the usage? So this is where, let's say, the we are also EV infrastructure providers. We're actually working with location providers like us to kind of identify where should the charging stations and the points be located. So to optimize, you know, based on what's around, to optimize maybe also if there's information based on density of EVs and usage and traffic density, and to leverage these location insights to make the best decision to actually scale the network. And then there's also, for the infrastructure provider, is to make sure that the providers can bring their data and actually combine it with other types of data from other providers or other let's say, POI data, to make sure that the vehicle, the driver at the end, when using an EV charging app or navigation with EV charging capabilities, does not have just the charging information, also has all the other elements that would make his EV usage easier. So at the end of the day, and I will not dwell too much, I'm just, let's say, ending on this, because I've been talking about the role of location. I put a couple of examples of some of the APIs and some of the capabilities that we are delivering ourselves as HERE technology to the industry globally. So can be, let's say, the things like the EV charging point APIs that provides the information, but it could also be complete solution like the HERE navigation that includes everything needed for EV and can be tailored for the EV usage. Also like things like the routing API, and this routing API can be leveraged on vehicles with combustion engine, but also with EV routing. And also very important, our routing API can also be leveraged for commercial vehicle routing together with the EV parameters to basically, let's say, maximize the use of EVs also when they are doing deliveries. And all in all, this is available part of our here location platform. So developers can actually get access to it and integrate it either in the vehicles or in applications or that are leveraged on mobile or in the vehicle dashboard. At the end, also our aim is to help reduce the range anxiety and provide data and provide better visibility of the network out there and kind of like the vehicles parameters and how these vehicle parameters can actually be combined with information from EV charging infrastructure, with road information, with traffic information, with weather information to better optimize the route and the route planning and the consumption model of the vehicles on the road. So this was it from my side. I'm looking forward to the conversation and see from the local experts. Hopefully this serves as a good scene setting. And yeah, at the end, if you have questions on the presentations, I'll be sticking around and I'll be taking at the end after the panel.
Thanks, Yurake. Hashim, all yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bala. Thank you, Andre, for that elaborate context-setting presentation. Very good afternoon to all of you. I think we have an august panel with us today, participants representing the who's who of the EV and the charging and infra, as well as the technology space. And I think since the topic being location and how that could power the adoption of EVs, to kickstart the discussion, let me take this question across to you, Dave. So we've heard about the role of telematics and CVs. OEMs have been talking about it for many years. Somehow in India, it didn't take off as much. Partly it was because the market is quite fragmented. Second was also because many were just using it as a track and trace service and not using the analytics that come with telematics. But now with the emergence of EVs, we understand that this interconnected web is very essential for some of the reasons that Andre also pointed out, to know where your charger is, based on that, what loads you could take, how you plan your trips, so on and so forth. So you as a EV CV OEM, how do you see the role of location telematics increasing primarily on account of the fact that now an EV needs to keep track of where it could be charged?
Yeah, thank you very much, Hashim. And thank you, Bala, for having me on this event today. It's a pleasure always to talk to the fellow professionals from the industry. Now, I think, you see, the point you have raised is how telematics can be more useful in EV. Now, EV is obviously a very significant change in the automotive industry, happening like once in a century kind of a profound impact-making change. On the other side, a lot of these technologies, whether GPS, radar, LiDAR, big data, IoT, all these technologies were there, right? So in EV, what is happening is these are all getting integrated. Now, this is a use case where in the EV vehicle ecosystem, these are all coming together. And then the users are able to make use of this. The point I'm making is how to get the best of these technologies. And actually these technologies are fuel agnostic, whether it is EV or IC or hydrogen or anything. You can employ these technologies to any of the vehicle. It doesn't matter. The point I'm making, and particularly in the context of India, is that the commercial vehicle space is highly disorganized. It is highly fragmented and also highly inefficient. I'll give you an example. A truck starts from Delhi to Chennai, for example, 2,000 kilometer or journey. It can take anything from 5 days to 15 days. Okay, and there are, of course, there are new logistic players, etc., coming in, committing delivery to you within a finite time, etc., etc. But largely, if you see, there are a lot of inefficiencies in the whole system. It starts right from loading of the vehicle. It takes almost 8 to 10 hours to load a vehicle. The vehicle is idle, just getting loaded. Then it starts, then the driver takes it over, and you're basically on the mercy of the driver, whether he goes to his village to attend his Bhatija's wedding or, does something else during the festival season, etc., etc. And then he reaches the destination. These technologies enable us to track the vehicle, also bring in the whole efficiency into the whole system. On the vehicle side, these telematics are on, basically we divided into 3 segments, I can say. In our case, like one is the vehicle diagnostics. Okay, the batteries being consumed, the charge depletion, battery charging, temperature of the battery, etc., etc. So those are part of the vehicle diagnostic, which almost every vehicle has. Then on the other side is the customer side API. Now this is where the routing, the intelligent traffic mapping, traveling, and also deviation from the route, hazard warning, etc., etc. comes, and also you pick up a lot of data. I think this is most important. Like Andre also said, apart from tracking, etc., I think the key is to collect the data, and then you should know what to do with that data. That is where the data analytics comes in, big data comes in, and how do you deploy it back to your system. I think this is where there is a lot of application I can see, particularly in the context of India, where, for example, our vehicle 3-wheelers are particularly on the last mile delivery. Now, last mile is essentially a very, efficiency oriented business, because all these e-commerce companies, for them, this is what matters. They do nothing else. It's a platform essentially. So now, one is that the vehicle that you are using, do you really need that much of space? It's kind of a space arbitrage business. You need a 2-wheeler, you need a 3-wheeler, because many times we have the data to prove that most of the time, or I would say a lot of time, you don't need, 170 CFT box, for example. Now, a bigger box, heavier vehicle will obviously consume more electricity. You will have lesser runs and lesser number of packets can be delivered. Now, if you are able to track and you are able to make a sort of a real-time judgment, then instead of a bigger vehicle, you can provide maybe a smaller vehicle. This is where the analytics comes in. So I think overall, if you ask me, there is a huge opportunity to integrate all these technologies and map your entire supply chain from point to point, on the vehicle side, on the logistics side, on the whole supply chain side. And end of the day, everything, comes down to the P&L of the company. So this is kind of a enabler for the whole logistics supply chain in the country, I would say. That's my view.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Dave, for elaborating on that, including the example of the trucks. And, clearly, I think the analytics on the data is where the real power of all that you've collected will come to the fore. And probably, given the dependence on the charging network for EVs, it'll probably catalyze the adoption of telematics to maybe even a larger extent, because that becomes one more driver towards people utilizing this data and running the analytics. Sure. Thanks for that perspective. Moving on, and let me take the question across to you, Animesh. So, what are some of the challenges that you see in last mile delivery, and how are they getting solved by incorporating, say, charging based on state of charge, length of trip, etc., as part of the route planning? So not just from a pure play pickup and delivery point of view, but also incorporating the whole charging aspect and the charging network locations.
Yes, Ashim, just to add to what Ashim was mentioning, and then I will answer on that last mile delivery. He mentioned about the load calculations, and they've mentioned about that how the kind of a boxes and the smaller boxes would mean you're more efficient, or a smaller capacity your commercial vehicle to go.
So this which leads to more efficient way of transporting or delivering the goods. This is one aspect which is very, very critical. Apart from that, when you talk about the last mile also has got a certain very critical thing is one, apart from the number of packages that you deliver, what is also important is that how you deliver. Which package to be delivered first, which package to be delivered second. This is one complication that comes to last mile delivery. Apart from that, what is also important is, as Andre pointed out, is one is the range of the vehicle that is provided by the OEM. The second is the actual range on ground. While the stated range could be about 200 or 250 kilometers, but what would actually come out would be about 150 kilometers, right? So what is the actual range that the vehicle can deliver based on the routing, based on the various external conditions, elevations of the road, etc. That also needs to be taken into account. When you talk about the the last mile delivery. So one what becomes important for the technology or location technology vendor to have the ability to map the entire I would say the delivery route in a way that it is able to maximize the number of packages that gets delivered, ensuring that it follows what I call is the path of the EV charging stations. Because definitely one EV charging, ideally one charging should do everything, but does it do it? Do you need more charging? So it has to be efficiently done, keeping in mind the delivery at the same time the charging stations. Now, moment the charging station also comes into picture, then there are complications around the kind of charging stations. Another thing that we need to keep in mind when we talk about the charging station, there are multiple types of charging station. There are some charging station which is there inside a market, or there are some charging station which is there inside the your cooperative housing society, which is definitely not available to a commercial. So when you're taking into account the kind of a data, when you're picking up the data for doing a multi-stop routing, as I call it, you would also need to understand the attributes of what vehicle you're carrying. Is it a passenger vehicle? Is it a commercial vehicle? So the truck attribute or the commercial attribute also becomes very important to be baked into your entire algorithm, which is required to ensure that there is a optimal delivery schedule that is maintained. So all these aspects, the location technology companies and companies like I would say the Here Technology, we do that. The algorithm that we have developed takes into account all these factors and ensures that there is an efficient delivery of the packages.
All right, understood. Thanks, Anish, for elaborating on that and explaining. I think one thing that you talked about was how, depending on the charging network, you're trying to ascertain one, how do you maximize the number of deliveries, say, with a single charge? I would sort of flip that question around and bring it to you, Ayushi. So, for you to say, since you capture all of this, you work on a lot of this data, right? So how do you do the optimization of the infrastructure demand and supply using, say, the data of vehicle, the trip lengths, the order pipelines, etc.? Because, from a charging network standpoint, it's also important that, the capacity utilization is there and you have sort of an optimal network there, right? So while Animesh is explaining, maximizing deliveries with a charging network, sort of flipping it around to you, given what sort of a route the cargo is going to take or how the the various lanes of cargo are going to be in terms of demand supply in the future, how do you plan the charging network?
Absolutely, no, great question. I think both Dave and Animesh did talk about it to an extent. It goes back to how much charge or / range the vehicle has, and then it also goes to where you want to set up this charging infrastructure from a location standpoint. So working for over 20 plus large clients, what we do going into any city is geospatially mapping where this charging hub has to be. I can't put 20 charging hubs each at each client's location and then ended up putting an infrastructure where most of the deliveries are being done, right? So I would say there are two ways of looking at it. One is planning your charging infrastructure in such a way that you're optimizing how close it is to where the vehicle picks up its deliveries in the morning. And the second aspect is deploying the right vehicle, which Dave was talking about. That it's not just about putting 4-wheelers, 3-wheelers, 2-wheelers on the road, but it's understanding what the real range of that vehicle is. what vehicle is actually needed, what is the load capacity, and then planning it with each client. So I can't put an FMCG client scenario towards an e-commerce client scenario. It does not work like that. So I would say it comes down to working with the client, it comes down to location, and it comes down to data in the end of the day, and really understanding that vehicle and how much you can actually stretch it in one charge. I would say that's the first option right now. I wouldn't go into fast charging as we are running 3 and 2-wheelers, and most of them are on slow charging as of now. 4-wheelers are coming in. Of course, Tata Ace has been launched. So there will be another angle to it. But again, it will come down to data and location and how everything will be planned around the larger delivery aspect. And I would also like to add that with each client, post sort of a week or two of trial, you do end up understanding what the larger radius is. So you don't end up putting a 80-kilometer range vehicle on a 120-kilometer range route anyway. So I would say the larger planning comes into play. And we haven't faced any issues in general when it comes to charging infrastructure. We do plan our sort of deliveries in such a way that in just one full charge, the driver is able to complete all its deliveries.
All right, right. Thanks for that perspective, Ayushi. And I think we clearly mentioned, it being very bespoke for each client out there. So working closely with them, preparing the vehicle, depending on the routes, and then setting up this charging network. I think with that sort of a perspective, Shreya, it's right for me to bring the conversation across to you, Amit. Since you actually set up the charging network out there. So what are some of the challenges for charge point operators while you're setting up this charging network? And also, if you could share a bit of a point of view, like Ayushi also touched upon it being very bespoke. Today, we are also seeing a situation where many OEMs are setting up sort of dedicated charging networks only for their vehicles. So, an open network versus, a network which is closed with the OEM. If you could share your perspective on these two things.
So thanks, Ashim, for your question. So basically, when you're talking about the challenges, the first challenge today for most of the setting up the charging infrastructure is the return on investment. As all of us understand, there is a very low adoption of EV at present. I'm talking current context. I'm not talking future, which looks great, with the penetration being less than 1%. So the footfall on charging station is fairly low. So the return of investment is a question mark. Now, the first point with respect to this is why is this low and what is it the industry is supposed to do to take care of this factor? The point which was mentioned by Andre in his presentation was related to range anxiety and the charging time. Now, here I would say it is while whatever you may do with respect to the range, whether even if it crosses 500 kilometers, the anxiety may still be there. And the charging time, as he mentioned, the fastest charging, it takes around 22 minutes. But at present in India, we are talking about charging station, which is going to take more than 1 hour. So again, these are two very crucial questions. But then, is it actually a challenge or it is something the way the market is being seen? So in my view, or ideally, it is a mind shift which is required to be taken to the end user. So basically, when you talk about refilling a vehicle, you have to go to a petrol pump. Now, vis-a-vis, if you look at an electric vehicle, the charging happens at a fragmented location, which means your charging will happen, I would say a slow charging will happen at your home, your office, your mosque, restaurant. So instead of going to a petrol pump, actually, the charging will happen where your vehicle is parked. So is it a challenge or is it an opportunity? That is the way it has to be looked at. What a public charging infrastructure actually does is it gives you opportunity for convenience charging. Now, that is where at that particular time, you will see whether it is going to take a time of 22 minutes or 50 minutes and so on and so forth. And if I look in terms of the charging infrastructure currently being set in India, the ratio is more towards slow chargers. It is more than 80% of the charger which is being set up today are of AC chargers on the slower side. Why it is so? Because the industry realizes this shift here. So the chargers are installed mostly in the residential societies, office complexes, malls, those kind of places. So the return on investment is a challenge which has to be addressed. Now, adding to this, how do you optimize the infrastructure? Now, that is where you have to create the charging infrastructure provider has to create a balance in meeting the breadth, location where the charger has to be installed, and availability of the infrastructure. Now, to do this, you need to have a reliable connected ecosystem wherein the user can locate and plug in the nearest charger. Even if you are setting up a charging infrastructure, the user should know where exactly the charger is available. So that comes as a part of second discussion wherein possibly you're talking about how the apps get integrated. Then if you have to optimize the infrastructure, then you also talk about what kind of collaboration happens, which is what you mentioned as a second question with respect to whether it has to be based on the OEM or it has to, is it an open structure or it is a structure wherein it is a hub kind of a structure. So at this moment, already there is a lot of collaboration happening in the industry between the different OEMs when you're talking about the four-wheeler infrastructure. And also there is a lot of investments or collaboration happening between the oil marketing companies. When you talk about further to this, while this is related to optimizing the number of charging stations, you have to also optimize the cost. Now the cost comes with respect to what is the mix of the charger you want to take. How many AC chargers, how many DC chargers, what kind of ratings, what kind of a charging connectors have to be planned for, whether it is CCS, CHAdeMO, GBT, so that kind of a planning has to come in. I'll cover it a little more. The biggest challenge I see today for the infra provider or charge point operator is with respect to ease of setting the infrastructure. Now, when I talk about ease of setting infrastructure, it is how do you find the availability of land, adequate infrastructure and parking space. Now, wherein probably the civic bodies play an important role in terms of management and allocation of land. Is there an ecosystem with a single window which allows easy getting of additional sanction load? This is one of the biggest challenge. While the space is allocated, but while the space is there, but the sanction load is not there. So the chargers are supplied, but it cannot be powered up because the load is not there. The grid infrastructure comes the next challenge in terms of whether the grid is available both on the LT side and the ST side in terms of availability of power. As we are slowly moving towards faster DC charger, the requirement on the infrastructure side is slightly complex. And currently, we are not facing the challenge of too many because it is a limited set of chargers. But once it comes to a large kind of a load, which comes with more EV vehicles coming in, then you possibly will have issues like grid stability, etc. For that also, the industry has solution. Then finally, with respect to the infrastructure, then you talk about how do you take care of the safety standards, whether it is related to the ambient conditions, it is related to the voltage fluctuation, ground faults, how these are being catered. Coming to your next question with respect to the hub infra versus the dedicated infra or the open infra. So basically, I would say that the fleet operators and the e-bus charging, this is basically into hub infrastructure because fleet operators will have a parking space for all the fleets and they set up a charging infrastructure keeping in view of that. So basically, they would set up a charging infrastructure which will be a mix of AC chargers, which will do overnight charging, and DC fast charger based on the different hub location, wherein all those location factors which other panelists talked about, that is considered. And e-bus, so basically, when you look at it as completely a bus depot, where the charging infrastructure is planned by the bus OEMs. So they work on an optimization of the running per kilometer. So they do all optimization, but it becomes a hub kind of a structure. Whereas when you talk about a distributed structure, then the four-wheeler market for private user, it is more of a distributed structure. The challenge comes in terms of two-wheeler charges. Till now, there is no common standard which is there. So most of the charging happens with the home charging with the AC chargers. DC charger, there is currently a gap in the industry or a consensus with respect to what kind of a gun is required. Though there is a Department of Science has now frozen on the standard, which has to be used here. But still, we see a lot of the OEMs planning their own individual infrastructure. But at this moment, industry is also trying to work together. All the OEMs, the infra provider, the oil marketing companies, they are trying to work together to move from infrastructure which is dedicated to OEM to an open infra. So that's what I would like to say here.
Sure. Thank you, Amit, for elaborating all the different challenges that are there, right from ROI to the grid, the ease of setting up of infra, collaboration, location, and also making sure also the sort of connectivity front and making sure that people know where the chargers are, and also your perspective on, the closed versus the open charging. I think one of the points that you raised was on the ROI front, and I would like to take that question across to you, Dave. So, as Amit said, it's about the ROI depends on how frequently people are charging, of that. At the same time, we see, and this debate has probably now started with the rise of battery prices, that probably too much of range is being packed into. Primarily, the debate is right now on the higher end car segment, but probably that could be extended across to the CV segment also. That a higher range means a more expensive battery, and a more expensive battery then means that much more difficulty of people to make the switch from ICE to EV. On the contrary, if we put, say, sort of a smaller battery, but then we align that with the charging infrastructure player. It could also be, not just fixed charging, but also swapping. We can probably reduce the size of the battery, and hence the cost of the vehicle, or hence the differential cost between an EV and an ICE vehicle. So you, as being one of the key OEMs in this space, would like to know your thoughts about this proposition.
Yeah, Ashim, on the economics of the whole EV, see, first thing is that this is a nascent industry. It is evolving. So on the technology side, it is evolving. Use cases are evolving. The whole the deployment side, customer side, it is going through a big sort of evolution. The way technology seems to be evolving on the battery side, I think another maybe 3 to 5 years, I don't think this range anxiety will be a debate. I think this will go out of the equation. The charge densities will increase, the range will increase correspondingly, the downtime for battery charging will reduce, and the life of batteries will increase. I see that happening pretty soon. So as of now, again, in the context of India, if we do not factor in the government subsidy, the FAME 2, no EV is viable.
Yeah.
Even factoring in the FAME 2 also, there is a very, very thin line that we have to really tread on, when almost 85 to 90% of the cost of the vehicle is your direct cost of manufacturing. So gross margin, single digit gross margin, obviously you can't make money. Now, every company plots its own trajectory, right? Every businessman or entrepreneur plots his own vision, whether it is a initial investment or you can bring in some economies of scale, efficiencies, etc. So my take is that on the whole EV, if you talk about, now there are two aspects, one is the P&L, second is the balance sheet and valuation. It is great to see companies raising money, okay, and which we haven't seen, or we did not see in the IC era. I was just looking at some data last 20 years, the biggest IPOs we had was 1,200 crore, Endurance and a couple of more. And average IPO size of automotive industry was 100 crores, and we used to be celebrating. Now 100 crores and 500 crore here, every day somebody is raising, which is great. I have absolutely no problem. There is a different debate on the viability and valuations, etc. So I'm not getting into that. The point I'm making is that the economics will have to be reworked once the whole cell and battery manufacturing starts in India. The battery economics will drive the economics of the whole EV business. The battery economics, when I say, one is the whole manufacturing side of it, the cell, then the module and the pack, the technology that you deploy, you choose, also the whole supply chain side of it. And we all know that lithium side, most of these critical materials will never be available in India. So you will have to secure some supply chains, etc. And then that's the manufacturing side. Then comes the whole battery usage side, the whole the charging, cost of charging or swap or whatever you choose. So that's where the whole regular usage or the cost that you incur will come in. And then third part is the end of the life, where the battery recycling will have to be brought into the whole value chain. And, I personally think that industry needs to start thinking on these lines. Of course, the big boys, Adani, Ambani, Tata, etc., would come up with their own cell manufacturing, and we will have hopefully enough capacities in next 5 to 10 years. The way the current trajectory looks, our internal calculation shows that India would probably need more than 200 gigawatt hours by 2030. If we are talking about the numbers which vary from 30% to even 80%. And in some form factors like two-wheelers and three-wheelers, I'm pretty sure, we will have maybe 60 to 70% conversion. So looking at that, I think the cell cost, the battery cost, the whole economics of this battery will determine the EV business as a whole. Because once you have so much of specific to EV content, which is batteries, motors, the VCU, etc., the rest is actually insignificant, right? So unlike the IC era, I think these are the areas which will determine the costs. Now, initially, you call it the heavy lifting, which OEMs have to do, or other stakeholders, charging players or grid or government, whatever. I think that there is no clear-cut answer anybody has as on today. There is a lot of debate. If FAME 2 goes out, what will happen? Honestly, I don't know. Nobody knows, that and the whole how this economics will play around. The battery costs jumped, as we know, because of war and supply chain issues and all. Now somebody says that, I was reading another report by, I think, Deloitte. They say that next 2 years or so, the battery costs will come down and it will be somewhere around, again, $100 per. So I think these are all best guesses by some very smart guys. I'm sure they know better than us as an industry players. Since the supply chain is just getting set up and it will take some time. See, these mature over decades. Cell manufacturing, for example, in US, the guys who operate gigafactories and all, I was talking to him and he said that it has taken them 10 years to reach that space of 1 gigawatt. So it takes time. And particularly in India, when you do not have any of these critical material supply lines and even refining, which is even more critical, and China controls and all of that, So I think the answer to a straightforward answer would be efficiency is going to play a key role, wherein IC engine overall in the ecosystem, whether passenger cars or commercial vehicles or any other vehicle, the efficiency was probably, I'm talking of the system efficiency. I'm not talking of vehicle efficiency per se, but the whole system efficiency was not so much, attended to. And we have, because there was no anxiety, and that every 5 kilometers you can get a fuel pump and you can fill up the fuel, etc. How many times do we even care, how much kilometer your car gives per liter? Not much. The point is that in this EV case, I think this whole range and anxiety thing in a way is good in the sense that it is driving and it is putting pressure on all the stakeholders to make the vehicle more efficient, make the system more efficient. And, we work with IIT Guwahati and Professor Praveen Kumar and his team. They're doing phenomenal work. They're mapping the whole data cycle. Sorry. I mean, the duty cycle of the vehicles, scooters. Now, India, there are many Indias within India. You out of Delhi NCR, you travel 50 kilometers, the India changes. Then you travel another. So what I'm saying is that these geographies, the driving habits, duty cycles, etc., will play a major role. And even 10% of efficiency improvement could lead to a lot of your, impact on the whole business economics. So that's what I would like to say on this.
All right. Thanks, Dave, for that here. And clearly, a bit of an efficiency improvement would have sort of a ripple effect across the ecosystem, cross charging, etc. And certainly, and battery prices, being the key determinant of the economics overall. Yeah, thank you. Now, I would like to ask some sort of questions which, probably all of you can share your perspective on. And maybe we could start with you, Ayushi, on that. So, there's this whole debate about the ownership of data. So in sort of an interconnected system like this, how do we decide the ownership of data between, say, a last mile delivery company, that is the end customer, the charging point operator, and the vehicle manufacturer, and also taking care of, say, data privacy in this. Since you are dealing with probably all of them all combined, maybe we could first take your perspective, and then maybe Amit, Animesh, Dev, you could also add yours.
Absolutely. That's a great front. I would like to talk about it from two perspectives. One is moving and one as a personal EV user as well. So as moving, I would say right now, and in general, the industry is evolving. So deciding who owns the data right now and starting a data war is not going to help anyone. But majorly, it's understanding how we can evolve across demand, supply, and infrastructure, right? How can we make better vehicles? How we can make better vehicle components? How we can enable drivers and e-commerce companies and FMCG companies to drive these electric vehicles, and how we can help utilize our infrastructure, and lastly, how we can help maintain that vehicle itself, right? An electric vehicle in the end is an electronic vehicle at its base, so we can do a lot more with it than a petrol diesel vehicle. So how can we leverage that data to enable, in our case, a driver, which we are doing, to have him or her understand that, hey, this is what you can do today, this is how much you can earn out of your electric vehicle, and you can actually end up earning more, and this is the data that supports it, and this is what your financing will look like, this is where your infrastructure will be, and this is what you'll be delivering. So that's how I see it. When it comes to my personal self, I do own a Nexon EV for now almost 1.5 years, and I do see how much data they're collecting. You go to their app and you see on the back end that for every trip you can see your driver behavior, your battery behavior, your degradation, and everything. So I would say I've never looked at it as why they're collecting that data. For me, I see it as in the end, right now, India does not have any internal local capabilities to manufacture these batteries. And that's why you need to understand battery degradation and the battery at a larger level to actually start manufacturing it locally. We all talk about what's happening in the sector overall, but we need to understand we have to work together initially to get to a point where we can start having these conversations overall.
Understand. So, it's an evolving system, and right now it's only benefiting everyone. Understood. Amit, if you would like to share your...
Yeah, so basically, if we look from a charging infrastructure point of view, it is basically you look at the data is being utilized by the original equipment manufacturer, the CPOs, and the central management system provider. So basically, most of the data will lie with the CMS provider. It is an end-to-end EV charging management software tool, and with architectural layers where this data security is taken care of. So in my view, it is if you have to look at data security, while the usage Ayushi very fairly covered, but from a data security point of view, it is basically a sharing which has to be mutually agreed between the OEMs of CPUs and the CMS provider, so that the data is being utilized in a rightful way and it does not end into kind of a privacy of the end user.
Understood. Sure. Animesh, your view on that.
Yes, so, just a few points here.
Yes,
I would not want to get into the legalities of who owns the data as such, whether it's the vehicle owner or the OEM themselves. But what I would want to say is that we got to, if you look at it, the amount of data that gets generated from all these EVs are nothing but it's like a computer. I mean, there is the your V2X, right? That's the vehicle to anywhere communication, and that leads to a huge amount of data. And this data that is getting generated, this data has got a lot of value in the industry. And this, the way we look at it is that it's a way to monetize your business. I mean, you can monetize those data. You can, like for example, from my company perspective, I mean, the way there are Amazon as a marketplace. Definitely. Similarly, we also have a marketplace where these data can be put on that marketplace. And then there are, for example, Ayushi spoke about the battery degradation, right? And I'm sure there are battery manufacturers who would want to understand the real world performance of the battery, and these data would be very valuable to them. So in a sense, these data can be monetized. There are multiple such information that gets generated which can be monetized. This is one. Secondly, we also, since we're talking about data, it's also important to talk about the data privacy, right? So at least and I'm sure every company that I have interfaced with have a data privacy view to the entire data that that they collect, including ourselves. We are a European company and we are a GDPR compliant company. So whatever data that we collect, we ensure that it is with keeping in mind the privacy law. Okay, so
Right.
so that's there, and these data, as we move forward, as the industry evolves, will become even bigger and bigger, and the newer use cases would come in. Like for an example, the driver behavior, right? Now, driver behavior, these are something which is very important from the insurance perspective, right? The insurance would love to understand and give you a personalized insurance premium based on your driving behavior. So this data becomes important. So similarly, there'll be, I'm sure there'll be 10 different types of data that can go to 10 different industries today. So data monetization is going to be a spin-off, a very important spin-off from this EV industry in India.
But what will be important to also note is who is monetizing it. So, is it the charging operator, is it the OEM, or because if there's money to be made there, then everybody's going to buy it.
Exactly. Even from what Amit mentioned about, he's setting up the charging stations and all, and people like us, we procure that data to be able to, so that it is there in our database, and we can then, while we are doing our route calculation, or we are doing a multi-stop routing, we know exactly the kind of charging infrastructure that Amit has done, the kind of a charger that is available, it is free or not available, what is the cost, where the booking can be done and all that. So this is, again, it's all gets enabled because of the availability of data.
Understood. Sure. Dave, your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think like Animesh mentioned, there are huge possibilities, enormous possibilities. And as vehicles become more and more intelligent, the system becomes more smart. So these will become a major source of revenue and profitability for OEMs. Already, there are data to prove for a car, for example, like Tesla, it has more lines of code than a Dreamliner, Boeing Dreamliner. So because of the way it operates, and also data on the vehicle side, I think that's very, very important to make the vehicle better, to also improve the efficiency of motors, batteries, mileages, temperature control, thermal management, etc., etc. So I think that's where the usage comes in. Now, coming on the personal side of it, whether I would like the company to, or the operator to know where I'm visiting, what I'm purchasing, etc., that is somewhere the whole debate will happen. And I think as industry grows, all these things will get settled. Already, as we know, now Amazon ended up buying a vacuum cleaner company, and they're saying they'll put a vacuum cleaner in your home, and that vacuum cleaner is going to watch what all you are doing. So, I mean, those are all various, as systems become more and more intelligent, IoT comes in. So I think these are endless possibilities. As industry evolves, a lot of regulations, the whole, the regulatory part of it, compliance part of it will also come into play, even in India. Also, an important part of it would be what happens when the vehicle gets discarded or gets sold, because in India, typical during a lifetime of 20 years or so, now the 15-year rule of the recycling is coming. So what happens to that data? And it could be very, very interesting debate. So all the answers are probably not there right now, but yes, the technology is immensely powerful, and I think a lot good can happen if you capture the data, analyze the data, and use it in a way that it improves the efficiencies and the whole system as a whole.
Understood. Sure. So, moving on from data, another question that, I would like to put across to all of you is, we've heard of these recent EV fire instances, right? So now, on the one hand, we say, there is the BMS out there and the battery that should have been sensing the state of the battery, disconnecting it, or the cells that are not in the normal operating range, or for that matter, even warning the user to take corrective action, so on and so forth. At the same time, we also know that, the charging equipment is also communicating with the battery and the BMS and pumping in current. So now when these instances are happening, how do we fix sort of warranty or accountability in this between, say, the EV and the charging operator? So maybe we could take your perspective first, Amit, and then also yours there on that.
Yeah, you want me to answer that?
Sure, you can start off as well.
Yeah. All right. I can tell you, from the OEM side, I think primarily the responsibility lies with the OEM, the vehicle maker. You can't say that the cells are not made in India. I buy from China or Korea or whatever. I think that's completely irresponsible. Somebody is saying like that. And I think it is our responsibility to ensure that there are design aspects of the battery. There are performance aspects of the battery, and then there are ambient conditions on which the vehicle is operating, temperature, etc., etc. I'll give you one example. For example, our trucks, 1-ton trucks, now we have put in use in Dubai, in UAE. Okay. Now the outside temperature is 52 degrees. The road temperature is 67 degrees. Now from the road, the peak summers, and it picks up the heat, goes onto the battery. Now the battery needs a cooling jacket. So that's an sort of modification or add-on that we put in there. Now in India, because of the length and breadth of the country, different temperatures from Kashmir to, Tamil Nadu, you need to know, what can go wrong where. And also since the standardization of charging plug points, etc., chargers have not happened, you also have to be careful. If you are charging at home, then of course there is a problem on the user side, and we need to educate the user. And currently, like the 2-wheelers and 3-wheeler, most of them will keep on happening, getting charged in this thing. Now, obviously, you cannot educate everyone. You cannot go to his home and check what kind of plug he's using, etc. So the safety part of it, the fail-safe mode part of it has to be built into the vehicle itself, so that it doesn't go wrong, even if it wants to go wrong. For example, why airplanes don't fall from the skies? It cannot. It is built like that. It is designed like that. It cannot, right? So I think that kind of fail-safe mode working will have to be built in, particularly when you do not know what kind of cell, what kind of battery you are using, whether it is coming from some player sitting in some province in China, maybe he's using used cells or D-grade cells or whatever. Even in India, you cannot check the cells. So I think a mechanism to sort of make a foolproof system has to be built in by the OEM. And that's where the R&D comes in. That's where technology comes in. And I think OEM need to invest in these and not just take a safe way out saying that I don't know what cell it is. So I think that's not right. Yeah, that's my take.
Sure. Amit, if you'd like to
add in. So I would completely agree with them because if you look at the vehicle, the single point where the control can happen is at the vehicle side. Even if you're talking about an outsourced battery, then the quality of that battery has to be a process which has to be laid down by the OEM. Now, most of the activity with respect to the charging is managed by the battery management system, whether it is monitoring the voltage, temperature, state of charge, how the entire battery has to be connected to the charger. So everything is being managed by the BMS. If you talk about from vehicle point of view, there are a lot of safety standards being managed. The charger has a clear safety standard as per IC and IS standards. It only follows the command which comes through the vehicle, whether it is through CAN or PLCC. And if there is BMS shows any abnormal behavior, any charger will trip and disconnect the power. So the overall responsibility, as they pointed out, in terms of how to make sure a fail-safe mechanism, even if it is a lot of outsourced component, the quality, how do you maintain the quality of that completely has to be, I would say it's the responsibility of the industry, but then overall control will lie with the OEM.
Understood. Sure. Then I think I have one more last question before, we also look at some of the audience questions that are out there. So, and maybe we could start with you, Animesh, on that, and then also take on with your perspective. So, we also see that in the same charging network, there's a lot of user variety. So there'll be a commercial passenger vehicle, there'll be a commercial goods vehicle, there'll be a personal vehicle, also different form factors, 2-wheeler, 3-wheeler car, or getting charged in the same network. how are some of the, the data that you've been collecting also helping optimize networks as per this? And does it also lead to some additional challenges? And what are some of the mitigating steps around that?
See, in fact, that's a very, very important aspect, because there are multiple OEMs, there are multiple, I would say, type of EV vehicles, right from a commercial, and commercial also there are multiple types: passenger, two-wheeler, three-wheeler, and each and as was pointed out by both Dave and Amit, that there are no standardization as yet from a charging perspective. So this is where I would say people like us, the location vendor, plays an important role in terms of creating that layer where we are able to keep the data of, what kind of charging stations are available, what kind of a charging infrastructure is available, what kind of interfaces are available, slow charge, fast charge. These are just one aspect. Apart from that, the location of that, whether it is inside a market, can there be, because if it's inside a market, obviously a commercial vehicle cannot go there. Only a two-wheeler or a three-wheeler can go there, right? So these are some of the factors that a location player like us, we collected from service providers. There are tier 1 service providers who collect the data from people who create the charging infrastructure, and then we incorporate these data as a part of our database, and then as a part of our algorithm, these all go into giving the input to the owner based on the category of the vehicle that he has, based on where he wants to go, based on the charging infrastructure, kind of charging infrastructure. So all these are the kind of a problem that a location player like here does solve it today.
Understood.
So from my perspective, basically, if we look at, as I mentioned earlier, the commercial vehicle will mostly fall into a hub kind of a category, wherein there is, as all panelists mentioned, there is a lot of planning which goes through while charging, setting up a charging infrastructure. Now here I am referring to whether you talk about the e-bus segment or a two-wheeler segment, or I would say a fleet operator in case of four-wheelers. So a lot of planning happens on a hub-based structure. Now here, the data is very, very crucial in terms of seeing the status of the vehicle, in terms of the charging level which is there with the vehicle, what kind of distance it has to cover. So that data is very, very critical. However, when it comes to the personal vehicles, it is basically the availability of the charging station with respect to what kind of gun and what kind of a charger which is available. Now, right now, there are that data is also available actually. If you look at the apps of individual charge point operators, it is very clearly available. But the challenge is there are more than 10 apps. Now, which app user has to actually subscribe to? So there is, when the integration of different apps will happen, that's something which may happen over a period of time. But currently, the location-based tools in searching, let's say, a charger location and trying to find out whether it meets your compatibility with the vehicle, that's something not very, very robust kind of a structure. And that's one area the industry has to actually work on.
Understand. Sure. So I think, with that, we've touched on multiple aspects of, location powering, the adoption of EVs, around charging and everything. And I think left for about 10 minutes in this discussion. So it's probably the right time to also look at some of the audience questions that are out there. So Bala, if you could help us out with some of the questions that are there.
Sure, Ashim. Thank you so much. Thank you to the panelists as well for a very, very intriguing and exciting and a very focused discussion. Yeah, we'll take in some questions from the audience. So some of them are visible to the panelists as well. We also have some that have come in the back end and also during registration. I'll start with one. I mean, a lot of these questions are, of course, focused on the core topic for today, on location technology, which is the solving a very important problem of range anxiety. So a lot of questions are focusing on the charging side. Before we go to that, can we have an understanding on some of the segments are fast moving to EVs, and they seem to make a lot of economic sense. For instance, the city bus segment in India in particular, post-pandemic, every single city bus tender that's come out has been for electric buses. Right? And also the two-wheeler space is fast moving to electric vehicles. So What about the last mile segment, be it goods transport or passenger transport? Is that another segment where we are getting convinced that it is going to go fully electric? Can we start with Dave and also take views from the others? These are open questions for anybody who wants to share views. Dave.
Yeah, last mile mobility, I think, is one of the fastest growing on the EV. The data to prove, on the three-wheeler, if I say, commercial vehicle three-wheeler, there are almost, we are at around 2,000 vehicles, that's Vahan registered vehicles. Mm-hmm. There are a certain percentage of it, addition to this, as who are not registered even. So roughly about 2,000, 2,200 vehicles per month is kind of electric vehicle now. As far as the e-rickshaw, the vehicle is concerned for last mile passenger transportation, it is amazing to see the conversion is more than 56% if you see last 3 months numbers. And interestingly, a new segment which is kind of 1 lakh below 1 lakh kind of a segment has emerged, L3 kind of a segment, which was not there in IC. IC typically the rickshaw starts around 2.35 lakh per vehicle. So it is very interesting to see that EV coming in not only as a alternate mode of the transportation, but also entirely new segment comes up. Now there's a pressure on the industry, even OEMs like us, we are looking at it because there's a significant number, and there are a whole lot of players. I understand a lot of it is happening by way of import from China, etc. But the interesting thing is that this is where customer wants it, and we need to address that market. There is a market of roughly about 25,000 vehicles per month are getting sold in this segment, right? So that's huge. That considering the overall market in India for three-wheelers is roughly about 400,000 to, let's say, 500,000. If you take into account the growth. So the point I'm making is that, EV is a game changer, not only from the technology and fuel point of view, but also a lot of these new segments will come up, which is where the opportunities will lie. And it is now the job of the OEMs like us and other mainstream players who are not there in the field today to look at this and address the requirement of a customer on, let's say, 1 lakh or 1.5 lakh kind of a bracket. This is because, about 250,000 vehicles in a year is not a small number. So I see that happening, this segment growing, increasingly, and probably by 2025, it would have converted to about 60% to EV. So that's very, very encouraging.
Significant numbers.
Yeah, very significant.
Anybody would like to add, or we move on to the next question? Right. So let's move on to the charging question. I mean, there is a lot of interest on how much of a change would a charging standard bring to the entire EV ecosystem. I mean, standardization is something that's being spoken about. We're still trying to identify what is the charging standard that India will adopt. Amit, would you want to share your views on how much of a difference maker would that be?
Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, there is already a direction in which the charging standards are moving. So when you talk about four-wheelers, it started with first range of vehicle, which started with GBT. Now GBT, if I have to say between GBT versus CCS, GBT is a little more economical, and that's where fleet operators have a preference for GBT. And since it is based on hub charging, it does not matter actually, even if a certain set of vehicles go on GBT technology. But the rest of the OEMs, they are shifting towards CCS. That's with respect to four-wheeler. Bus charging also, we see a clear trend moving towards CCS. It is basically into the two-wheeler segment where there was not a common standard, which is also recently there has been a specification towards IC 62196. Most of the OEMs are moving towards that. The current challenge in case of two-wheeler segment is the OEMs even today are setting up their own private charging infrastructure. But with respect to setting up a standard, there is a guidance which is there. And to me, it looks like it's not far away when the charging standards will be common across different vehicle segments.
Okay, wonderful. Andre, can I have your views, Andre? I mean, since given here technologies, presence globally and a lot of work that you've done in markets like Europe, which are also spearheading, the EV adoption globally. I mean, what is your take on the importance of charging standard, and what role does here play in bringing all the, putting all the pieces of the puzzle together as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed, that's actually a very good question, and I think Europe has already achieved. So they did not reach a common charging standard, but what actually happened was that I think there was a law maybe a couple of years ago that when you are building a charging station, you would have to provide all the major standards. So you need to have CCS, you need to have sizeable. So then in reality, even if you have a different connector, your charging station will actually be adapted to the vehicle instead of the other way around, right? Mm-hmm. So I think this was kind of, let's say, the step. I would say it probably works quite well in reality. In practice, what's actually a bit of a challenge is that, so leaving aside the connector, one of the challenges is that sometimes the charging stations and the cars do not communicate. Sometimes, there might be software protocols issues, and you end up there even at, let's say, in a mature market, and your car does not charge. So then you have to call the assistants to say, hey, what can I do? Let's reset, would be this, would be that. They reset the charging station. So I think there's still some work to be done in terms of the communication between the charging station and the car. This is mostly applicable for fast charging. So for slow charging, when you're handling little current, this typically does not happen. But for DC and high-speed charging, sometimes, more often than you would believe, these, let's say, communication issues between the cars and the charging station happen. So this would also be something to be certainly be looked at. I know this. So typically this also happens from the OEM side, because when OEMs, they're putting a vehicle, and I know from my past experience, they typically test the charging stations. But sometimes you cannot test all the charging stations from all the manufacturers are out there. So especially the first EVs that have rolled out on the market, there was always kind of like a bit of a question mark, will it work or will it not work? Now it comes, let's say, these EVs also, what's nice about them, they have over-the-air software capabilities. So you can actually, once you figure out, okay, what's wrong, you can send the software update and then it will be compatible with the charging station. But this is also some of the learnings, as you said, about, let's say, the standards. From our side, what we're, let's say, asked by the customer is that when we're providing information about the charging station, it's important to have the charging provider, the charging connector, the charging power, and also the payment mechanism. Because also sometimes it might happen that you end up to a new charging provider and they do not accept your charging card. So you need to have a special charging card, or you need to have like a MasterCard or something else. This also happens. So these are, let's say, the parameters that you would try to avoid. And for example, in the navigation, you could say, okay, I'm filtering this charging provider and this charging payment because I know that's going to work.
So, Andrea, I completely subscribe to your point on the importance of communication between the charging infra and the vehicle. And in fact, I would agree with you. This is one of the largest problems. But I would also say that industry works very closely with the charging infra suppliers. It's something very close interaction, and I would like to say here there is a large improvement because of collaborative effort between the OEMs and the charging infra providers. But yes, you're right; it is the biggest challenge at this moment.
Yeah, you're absolutely. I want to say I'm not saying that this is overcome. I think this will be fixed immediately. It's just one of the kind of like the birth pains of having EV at scale everywhere.
Yes.
Interesting. Very, very interesting observations, Andre and Amit as well. Okay, there was a discussion. Ashim had a question on data sharing, right? Who owns the data? Here is a possible proposed solution from one of our friends from the audience. Is it possible to create a common data sharing platform, just as in an air crash investigation? So something on those lines would, since we have different stakeholders from the EV space here, what is your take on a common data sharing platform that has to run across competing vehicle OEM infra companies? Animesh, would you want to share your view since it's related to data?
Okay, so frankly, it's a very, very tough answer, because when you talk about data, primarily the data is driven by what I call as a privacy law, right? And it's also when, from our perspective, as I told you, we are a GDPR compliant company. We know how to massage the data before we take it, so that we are compliant to the law perspective. Secondly, as we discussed earlier, there's a huge potential for monetizing this data. And this potential of monetizing this data would probably be a debate between who owns the data, because there is a lot of revenue, expected potential future revenue associated with it. So would all competing OEMs come together and agree to give access to this data to a common platform? I mean, I'm speaking as a personal person, not as a here. I have my doubts, right? This is my personal feeling, because I mean, there are so many use cases that is coming out on a regular basis. The potential of the data usage is immense. And when it comes to creating a common platform, who will create the common platform? Will it be, what kind of agreement will exist between that common platform, the OEM, and the person who's using it, right? So it's a very complicated. I'm not sure I have the answers. I would leave out to the other panelists to maybe speak about it.
So while I don't have a relevant experience, but I talk with respect to some experience related to telecom. Now, if there is a data which is, let's say, if there is a person who has to own the data, and it is something like various stakeholders will have to come on a common platform and agree on a revenue sharing mechanism and investment sharing mechanism. And also with respect to the security of the data and how it has to be utilized. This works very well in telecom segment when you talk about value-added services. On a similar line, I really don't know how this has to be done, but there has to be a larger industry participation and agreement on what kind of model which can be worked out.
Thank you. Yeah. Anything from Dave or Andre, do you want to share your view?
Yeah, I think, the simple and straightforward answer to me is that, whoever owns the asset technically owns the data. But again, there are various, when you dig a little deeper, there are various other issues which prop up, because here in India, there is vehicle leasing, financing, also third-party operation, etc., etc. So that is where the whole game becomes complex. So I think, to my mind, for the OEMs, this will be a huge revenue and monetization opportunity. Even on the vehicle diagnostic level data itself, how for example, the tires are behaving, how is the battery behaving, charger behaving, etc., etc. So all that can be monetized to make the whole system more efficient, whole system more, profitable. So that's the vehicle side of it. Or coming on the customer side, where the vehicle is running, where he's going, what is he doing, etc., etc. I think that is where it's not easy to sort of find an answer to. And I don't think practically it is possible to have a common sort of a shared platform or something. I think it's not, practically it's not possible. See, today you are having just, few thousand vehicles. Like tomorrow you're going to have millions of vehicles. How will you do it? It's not possible. But the OEMs who invest in on the platform, on the VCU, on the connectivity, on the cloud server, etc., I think they will have sort of, if I might say, right of first use, then probably it's not wrong. That's my opinion.
Maybe if I can comment on that, as I heard my name. I think also when we are talking about the data, probably it makes sense to look into which type of data. And I think there will be data that definitely is very valuable for the OEMs, like how your vehicle is performing and your battery performance. That's something that they can make use of it. But there are also other types of data, like for example, if we take the example of location data of what we do, might be or might not be so, let's say, interesting for the OEMs. So let's assume the following, that you are connecting a vehicle to a charging station and, that doesn't work. so that it says that the charging station is not available and stuff. This is the type of data that would actually be interesting for the OEMs more or less, because they don't own the charging, would be more, let's say, for the ones that actually operate the charging stations, to know that, at this point, at this time of the day, this EV tried to charge and it did not charge. And why is that? And where is the charging station out of? So you would say, okay, the charging operator would be interested in that type of data. But you could also say that the other EV users might be interested in the data to avoid stopping there. And this is where, if you're thinking about, let's say, sharing data for the use of, for enhancing the use case of EV, looking at just kind of like OEM by OEM individually probably doesn't make sense, because you don't have the scale, right? You would have, let's say, the offering for your customers, but you would not have the scale to cover all roads and all situations. So this is where this would be the type of use case where, let's say, pooling data from multiple OEMs on location platforms, it might actually bring the benefit. We have, let's say, I'll be honest with you, I think in the case of EV, we do not have that much, let's say, services where we're pulling data from multiple OEMs, but we do have services in terms of safety services where we're leveraging data from multiple OEMs. And why there's actually the interest from them to actually share it, because, even if you have 1 million vehicles, this type of services works better if you have 5 million vehicles from multiple OEMs and they're exchanging data anonymously. So in my view, I would say, there's a lot of ways to leverage this type of data. And I think the data is definitely very useful, but I think it also depends on the use case, because there are use cases where it makes more sense to share the data rather than just to keep it in your OEM fleet.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Andre and Dave and Amit and Animesh as well. I think it's time to call it a day with the session. I think we've hit our time. Thank you so much. Firstly to Andre for setting the context, setting the tone for a very, very interesting discussion with a very, very nice and insightful presentation. Thank you so much for your presence, for sticking around to also answer some questions as well. Absolute pleasure having you. Thank you to our panelists, Dave, for bringing in the OEM perspective, some very, very interesting insights from your side. Amit, as well on the charging infrastructure side, which is probably at the heart of today's discussion. And of course, Animesh for bringing in, again, the technology perspective as well. And at times when we talk about EVs, it's very common that the discussion goes out of hands and we can get lost because it's such a vast topic. Thank you so much, Ashim, for keeping it very, very focused, very, very pointed, and for probably bringing out some very, very practical and relevant insights from our panelists as well. So thank you so much, all of you, and thanks to our audience as well. There are some more questions that came in related to safety, related to charging infrastructure, of course. We've tried to give you a glimpse on whatever possible with the time that we've had. Thank you so much for your attendance. And as always, you can find a recording of the entire session on our YouTube channel, video channel on YouTube, and also a copy of Andre's presentation will be up on the Motor India website. Just go to the webinars page, and then you'll find a copy of its presentation, and also a copy of all the presentations that we've had in our past webinars with Here Technologies as well. Yeah. And a big thank you to our partner, Here Technologies, for continuing this webinar series with us, bringing out some very, very interesting insights on different topics, for the benefit of the industry. So until our next session, and we hope to have all of you again in a future panel, because the EV industry is definitely only in its nascent stage. I'm sure a lot of the things that were discussed today will be seen on the ground level in the years to come. And we hope we can have you again for another similar discussion sometime, during the rest of the decade. Yeah? So until our next session, thank you so much to all of you, and take care and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Bala. Thank you, Ash.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, guys.